Ah, welcome. Warm yourself by the fire. Have a seat or snuggle up in your favorite spot and let me tell you a story. Rye and Spierig were two Highland dogs who lived in a beautiful valley not far from the west coast of Scotland, where high hills sloped down to the shores of a blue loch. The name Ree means a king and Spierig means a sparrowhawk, but they're words no one except a Highlander can pronounce properly. However, the dogs had a great many friends who could not talk Gaelic, and when English-speaking people called them Ree and Spira, they would always answer. Rye was a great tawny deerhound, tall and slender, very stately, as a king should be, and as gentle as he was strong. He had a rough coat and soft brown eyes, sat rather near together, and very bright and watchful. His chief business in life was to watch the faces of his friends and to obey their wishes quickly, to take his long limbs away from the drawing-room hearth-rug when the butler came in to put on the coals, or not get in the way more than a big dog could help, and not to get too much excited when anything in the conversation suggested the likelihood of a walk. But his father and all his ancestors had led very different lives. They'd been trained to go out onto the mountains with men who hunted the wild deer and to help them in the chase. For the deerhounds run with long bounds and are as fleet as the stag himself. Then, when the beautiful creature had been killed, it was their duty to guard the body and to see that the carrion crows and eagles or other wild birds should not bother it. But Rye's master was a bishop, who, though he lived quite near a great deer forest and often took his dogs over the hills to where the deer lived, never killed anything, but loved to see all his fellow creatures happy among the things they liked best. Spierig was a very little dog, of the kind that is called a Skye Terrier, though the island of Skye is one of the few places in which a long-haired terrier is very rare. He was quite small, what his Highland friends called a wee bit doggy. He was very full of life and courage, wonderfully plucky for his size, like the fierce little bird whose name he bore. Like a good little many people, he lacked the dignity and repose of his big companion, and, though very good-tempered among his friends, was quick and ready to bite if beaten, and did not take a scolding with half the gentleness and humility with which Rye would submit to punishment, perhaps because he needed it oftener, for he was so busy and active that he sometimes got into scrapes. He was only 3 years old at the time of this story, and Rye was 7, so it was perhaps natural that Rye should be the wiser of the two. They lived in a beautiful house quite near the loch, and they had a large garden to play in, and they could go in and out of the house and do just as they liked, so long as they came when they were called and did as they were told, and did not climb on the sofa cushions when their feet were muddy. There were very few houses on their side of the water, and as their friends went about in boats as often as other people go out in carriages, the dogs were used to the water and could swim as easily as walk, and what is more, knew how to sit still in a boat, so they were allowed to go everywhere with their friends because they gave no trouble. They had a very happy life, for there was always something going on, which is what dogs like, and plenty of people to go on walks with. Their young masters sometimes went out with guns, and a dog, a country dog, loves a gun better than anything in the world, because he knows it means a business in which he can help. Sometimes their mistress took them for a walk, and then they knew that they must be on their best behavior and not wander too far away from the road and have to be whistled back, and not fight with the collies at the cottage doors, nor chase cats, nor be tiresome in any way. They generally kept close beside her, Rye walking very slowly so as to accommodate his big strides to the progress of a poor human with only 2 legs, and Spearing trotting along with tiny little footsteps that seemed to make a great fuss and to be in a great hurry about nothing at all. There was nothing, however, so delightful as going for walks with their own master, the bishop. For one thing, they generally knew he really meant to do something worthwhile. Pottering about with a gun or escorting a lady is pleasant enough, but it generally means coming home to a lunch or tea, and the real joy of a dog's walk is to feel that you're getting further and further away from home, and that there are miles of heather and pine wood behind you, and yet you're still going on, with chances of more hares and more squirrels to run after. Sometimes the bishop would stop at a shepherd's hut or a lonely cottage under the lee of a hill, and sometimes he would sit down to examine a flower he had gathered in the wood. But they forgave him very good-temperedly, and could always find something to interest them while they waited. Rye generally sat down beside his master and stretched out his great limbs on the heather, for he liked to think that he was taking care of somebody or something. Spearing would lie down for a minute, panting with his little red tongue hanging out and his hairy little paws all wet and muddy. But he never rested for long, and would dart off, pretending to have found a rat or a squirrel, even if none really existed. It was in December 1887. The weather was raw and cold. There was ice floating about the loch, and the seagulls used to come up to the garden terrace to be fed. The young masters were away, and mistress could only take walks along the road. There was nothing to tempt her to a mountain scramble or a saunter in the woods. The bishop was very busy, and day after day the dogs would start up from the rug at the sound of the opening of his study door upstairs, and after a minute's anxious listening, with ears cocked and heads erect, they would lie down again with a sigh of disappointment, for there was no sound of the approach to the hat stand nor of a whistled invitation for a walk. Finally came a sad day when the bishop went away, and dog life threatened to become monotonous. Then, one Saturday, hope revived, for a visitor came to the house, an old friend, whom they loved and trusted as a good dog always loves what is trustworthy. He was a frequent visitor, and had in fact left the house but 3 weeks before. He was there for a holiday rest, and had leisure to bestow on dogs and long walks, which they always shared. He was very thoughtful for them, not the sort of man who would set off on a whole afternoon's ramble and say, when half-mile on his way, "I wish I had remembered Rye and Spearing." He always remembered them, and thought for them, and when he fed them after dinner, would always give big biscuits to the big dog and little biscuits to the little dog, and it is not everyone who has the sense for that. Every day, and often twice a day, he took them out, down to the church or the pier, or across the loch and up the pass of Glencoe, where stern gray hills and hovering eagles and a deep silent valley still seems to whisper together of a sad true story that happened there in just such weather as this 200 years ago. These were very happy days for the dogs, for they did not mind the cold. It was only an excuse for wild scampering and racing, and they were very grateful for their friend's return. He had been ill, but was able to enjoy his walks, and though about 60 years of age, he had all those qualities of youth which endear a man to a dog or a child. He was brave and unselfish, and strong to love and to endure, and they loved him without knowing why, without knowing that he had lost his health from overwork in the service of the poor and suffering, and among outcasts so low as to be beyond the sympathy of any heart less loving than that of a dog or of a very good man. Father McConaughey, he was always called, and though he had never had wife or a child of his own, many a fatherless child, and many a lonely grown-up man or woman felt that it was quite easy and natural to call him by a name so sacred. On the Wednesday after he came, he took Rye and Spierig for a glorious walk through the shrubberies and out through a gate onto the road at the foot of the hills behind, a road that winds on and on for many miles, the mountains rising steeply above, the loch being cold and gray below. The bank that slopes away from the road to the water in places covered with gorse and low bushes and heather, where an enterprising dog may hunt for rats and rabbits, or rush headlong after a peewit or moorfowl as it rises with a scream at his approach and flutters high off into the air, and then descending to within a few feet of him, skims low before him, hopelessly far, and yet tantalizingly near. The way was familiar to them, by land or by water. Often they sailed up the loch in the same direction, further and further into the heart of the mountains, the valley becoming more and more narrow, until, had they gone far enough, they would have reached the Dog's Ferry, a spot where the water is so narrow that a dog may easily swim across. Rye, a strong swimmer that he was, had often crossed the loch near his master's house, where the ferry boats ply, and needed no dog's ferry, but few dogs made such powerful strokes in the water as he. This day, however, they did not reach the Dog's Ferry. The afternoon was closing in, and there were streaks of gold in the dull gray sky, and it was the good father's thought that it was time to return. "Never mind, little man," he said to Spierig, who looked reproachfully at him with wistful brown eyes gleaming through overhanging silvery locks. "We'll do it tomorrow, only we must be off earlier." Well, this was good news, and the little dog started home happily, running as little dogs will, 10 miles at least, to every one of the roads, and tired enough when home was reached at last. Dinner was a welcome feast, and Rye and Spierig slept sound till it was time for evening service. They always attended chapel, night and morning, and took their places at the foot of the steps, halfway, when both were present, between mistress in her seat and master at the place of his sacred office. Tonight, as usual, they remained perfectly quiet and apparently indifferent to what was going on till, at the words, "Lighten our darkness," bedtime came into the immediate prospect, and they started into the expectant attitudes and were waiting the final amen. The next morning, though cold, it was fine and fairly bright, and the dogs watched eagerly for signs of the promised walk. The service in chapel was rather long this morning, for it was Advent. The Benedicite was read, and though Rye and Spierig noticed only that they had time for a longer nap than usual, there were some present who will never forget, as the season comes around again each year, the special significance of part of that song of praise. But at last, the service was over, and the dogs trotted out into the hall and followed mistress and their friends to the front door to see what the weather was like. It was not an especially pleasant morning, but it would do for a walk, and after waiting a few minutes to have some sandwiches cut, the only detention that could be endured with patience, the three set out. After about 6 miles, they were on new ground, but on they went, the loch to the right of the road getting narrower, on past the Dog's Ferry, and still on, till the loch had become a river and could be crossed by a bridge. Rye and Spierig knew, by a more certain method than looking at clocks, that it was lunchtime, 1:30 at least, and they never thought of doubting that they would cross the bridge and turn homewards along the other side of the loch, and so get in at about tea time or so. Or, for their friend was enterprising, by a longer way also on the further side, either of which would involve a delightfully long walk, but with just that hint of a homeward turn which even to dogs is acceptable when breakfast has become a mere memory. They accordingly followed the road on to the bridge, but as Father McConaughey did not overtake them, Rye, ever watchful of his friends, turned to look back and saw him speaking to a girl, after which, to their surprise, he whistled them back, and instead of continuing along the road as it turned off to the right, they kept straight on, though there was now only a rough track leading through a gate into the wood beyond. When they had advanced a few paces into the wood, he sat down under a tree and took out his packet of sandwiches. Rye and Spierig, sitting close beside him, had their share, or perhaps more, for their wistfully brown eyes hungrily reminded him that they had multiplied the distance some times over, and that an unexpected luncheon out of doors is a joy in a dog's day, of a kind for which a man may well sacrifice at least a part of his minor pleasure. Starting off again with a fresh delight, on they went, further and further, always climbing higher and getting deeper into the wood. To the left, the steep mountainside rose abruptly above them, and to the right, below the path, the river tore its way between steep banks, down to its home in the loch. Now and then, the trees parted and made way for a wild mountain torrent leaping from rock to rock down the hillside and rushing across their path to join the river below. As they climbed further, these became more frequent. Their friend could stride across, setting an occasional foot upon a stepping stone, and Rye, too, could cross safely enough, long-limbed as he was, though now and then he had to swim, and the streams were so rapid that it needed all his strength to cross the current. Sometimes he helped Spierig, for the brave little dog would always try to follow his big companion, and sometimes, with an anxious bark, would give warning that he needed help, and the kind father would turn back to pick up the little dog and carry him till they were in safety. It was very hard work. They were always climbing, and in many places the road was polished with a thin coat of ice, but the dogs feared nothing and kept on bravely. The path dwindled to a mere track, and the climbing became steeper still. The streams crossed their road still oftener, and the stones were slippery with ice. The wood became thinner, and as they had less shelter from the trees, great flakes of half-frozen snow were driven against their faces. There was no thought now of hares or stags. Rye and Spierig had no energy for anything but patient following. Poor little Spierig's long coat was very wet, and it dried a little, and it then became hard and crisp with frost. The long hair falling over his eyes was matted together, tangled with briars, and his little feet were sore and heavy with the mud that had caked in the long tassels of silky hair. Even Rye was very weary, and he followed soberly now instead of bounding along in front. His ears and tail drooped, and each time he crossed the ice-cold water he seemed more and more dejected. As they left the wood behind them, the snow fell thick and blinding, but just at first. As they came out into the open, it seemed not quite so dark as under the trees. There was nothing to be seen but gray sky and gray moor, Even the river had been left behind, and only blackened patches remained to show where, in summer, the ground was spread with a pretty carpet of purple heather and sweet bog myrtle. They got deeper and deeper at each step in half-frozen marsh. There was no sound or sign of life. The dogs felt hungry and weary, and they ached with the cold and wet. But they were following a friend, and they trusted him wholly. Well, they knew that with each step that it was taking them farther and farther from home and farther into the cold and darkness. But dog wisdom never asserts itself, and in trustful humility, they followed still, and the snow came down closer and closer around them, and even the gray sky and the gray moor were blotted out, and the darkness fell. It was a disappointing homecoming for the bishop that Thursday evening. There was no hearty handshake from his waiting friend, no rejoicing bay of big dog or extravagant excitement of a little dog to welcome him. The three had been out the whole day, he was told, and had not yet reappeared. A long walk had been projected, but they had been expected home long before this. When dinner time came and they did not appear, 2 servants had been sent out with lanterns to meet them, as the road, though not one to be missed, was dark and some small accident might have happened. The men were not back yet, but doubtless the missing party would soon return. The night was dark and stormy, and Father McConaughey had been for some time somewhat invalid, and as time passed, the bishop became increasingly anxious. At length he ordered a carriage, and with the gardener set off towards Kinloch, the head of the loch, thinking that an accident or weariness may have detained his friend, and the carriage might be useful. On the way, they met the first messengers returning with the news that nothing could be heard at Kinloch of the missing 3, except that they had passed there between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The bishop and his men sought along the road and inquired for tidings at the very few houses within reach, but in vain. The night was dark and little could be done, and there was always the hope that on their return they might find that some tidings had been heard, and that the lost friends might have come back by some other side of the loch. So at last they turned back, reaching home about 4 o'clock in the morning. No news had been heard, and all felt anxious and perplexed, but most believed that some place of shelter had been reached, as the dogs had not come home. They could find their way home from anywhere, and there seemed little doubt that, overtaken by darkness, all 3 had found shelter in a shepherd's or gamekeeper's hut, perhaps on the other side of the loch, as they had almost certainly crossed the bridge, no one having met them on the road by which they had started. Nevertheless, all that was possible must be done in case of the worst, and as soon as daylight returned, 4 parties of men were dispatched in different directions, the bishop himself choosing that which his friend and dogs were known to have taken the day before. A whole day of search over miles and miles of the desolate wintry mountains revealed the one fact, that the party had eaten their luncheon under a tree in the wood beyond the bridge. The squirrels had left the sandwich paper there to tell the tale, and for the first time it seemed likely that they had not turned homewards on reaching the head of the loch, by either side of the same road they had come, or by that on the other side of the water and through Glencoe. One by one, the search parties came home with no tidings. No trace of the wanderers had been seen. No bark of the dogs had been heard. No help had been found toward the discovery of the sad secret. Weary and heartsick as all felt, no time was to be lost. Every hour made the anxiety greater, and all were ready in a very short time to start afresh. Again, for the second time, all through the long night they wandered over the mountains, through the woods, and across the deer forest beyond. It was an awful night. Again and again were their lights blown out. The snow lay deep in all the hollows where the streams had overflowed their banks. The path was a solid sheet of ice. The rocks, polished and slippery, were climbed with utmost difficulty. At every opening in the hills, an ice-cold wind whirled down the glen and corrie. Sleet and hailstone beat against their faces. The frozen pools in the marshes gave way beneath their feet. The night was absolutely dark. Not a star shone out to give them courage. The silence and the sounds were alike awful. Sometimes they could hear each other's labored breathing as they tottered on the ice or waded through the snow, and sometimes all other sounds were lost in the shrieking of the whirlwinds, the crackling of the ice, and the roaring of the swollen, angry streams. What could have happened? Even if accident had occurred, either or both of the dogs would surely have returned. And how could even a Highland dog, hungry and shelterless, live through such a night as this? Well, morning came again, and returning to the point near the bridge at which the carriage had been left, two of the parties met and drove home for food and dry clothing and to learn what others might have to tell. There was no news, and again, the same earnest friends, with many more kind helpers, set out on their most hopeless journey. The trackless wilds of the deer forest seemed the most likely field for search, and all now, in various groups, set off in this direction. Hour after hour passed without any gleam of hope, and even the bishop began to feel that everything possible had been done, and was turning sadly homewards. A second party, a few hundred yards behind, had almost come to the same resolve. Many of the men had been without rest since Thursday, and even the dog, who, with one of the keepers of the deer forest, had joined the party, was now limping wearily, and was exhausted by the cold and the rough walking. Suddenly he stopped, and with his ears pricked and his head erect, he listened. No one knows better than a Highlander the worth of a collie's opinion, and more than one stopped to listen too. Not far away, and yet faint, came the bark of a dog. Among the men was Sandy, one of the bishop's stablemen, who knew and loved rye and spear, and his heart leapt up as he recognized the deerhound's bay. Away to their left, the mountains were cleft by a narrow glen. The sound came from the bank on the hither side. The bishop and his party had climbed to the further side, but a shout reached them, alert and watchful as they were. They turned back, wondering, scarcely daring to hope. The men who had called to them were hastening to give a point, the dog's nose to the ground preceding them. There is no mistaking the air of a dog on business. The collie's intenseness was as different from his late dejection as the present haste of the men from the anxious, watchful plodding of their long search. In another moment, they came in sight of something which made them hold back the dog, and which arrested their own footsteps. The bishop himself must be the first to tread on what to all felt was holy ground, for there, on the desolate hillside, lay the body of Father McConaughey, wreathed about with the spotless snow, a peaceful expression on his face. One on either side sat the dogs, watching still as they had watched through the 2 long nights of storm and darkness. Even the approach of friends did not tempt them to forsake their duty. With hungry, weary faces, they looked towards the group which first came near them, but not till their own master knelt down beside all that remained of his old friend did they yield up their trust and rise, numb and stiff, from the posts they had taken up, for who knows how long before. To say a few words of prayer and thanksgiving was the bishop's first thought. His second was to take from his pocket the sandwiches he carried and give all to Rye and Spierig. A bear was contrived of sticks from rough fence that marked the boundary of the deer forest, and the body was lifted from the frozen ground on which it lay. The return to Kinloch, where the carriage waited, was very difficult, and the bearers had to change places very often. Slow was their progress. It was as rapid as Rye could manage, numbed with cold and exhausted with hunger. The little dog was easily carried, and for once, little Spierig was content to rest. No one will ever know what those faithful dogs felt and endured during those 2 days and nights of storm and loneliness. Those who sought them in the darkness of that second awful night must have passed very near the spot where they lay, sleeping, perhaps, or deafened by the storm, or even possibly listening anxiously with beating hearts to the footsteps which came so near, and yet turned away, leaving them, faithful to their post in the night. They, in their degree, like the man whose last sleep they guarded, were true and faithful servants. It is pleasant to know that Rye and Spierig did not suffer permanently for all they had undergone. They lived for 5.5 years after, and had many a happy rambling when the sun was bright and the woods were green, and squirrels and hares were merry. They could not be better cared for than they had always been, but, if possible, they were more indulged. They contrived to get a dinner in the kitchen as well as in the dining room, and their friends always remembered the days when they had nothing, and nobody told tales or refused them. If they lay in the sun quite across the front door, or took up the whole of the rug before the winter fire, everyone felt that there were years of warmth to be made up to them. Their portraits were painted, and in the sculpture which in his own church commemorates Father McConaughey's death, the dogs have not been forgotten. Rye was the elder of the two, and towards the end of his 13 years, showed signs of old age and becoming rheumatic and feeble. But Spierig, though 3 years younger, did not long survive him. They rest now, under a cairn in the beautiful garden they loved so well. Dark green firs shelter their grave. A gentle stream goes merrily by on its way to the loch below, and in the crannies of the stone of which the cairn is built, foxgloves and primroses and little ferns grow, fresh and green. On the cairn is this inscription: in memory of 15 December, 1887, Rye died 19th of January, 1893. Spierig died 28th of August, 1893. If you like these stories, subscribe, like, and share. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for future stories. And as always, I thank you for taking the time to listen. The end.